New Wall Street Journal report saying this morning that Donald Trump's allies are quietly drafting proposals that would attempt to erode the Federal Reserve's independence if the former president wins a second term. Joining us right now is one of the authors of this article, Nick Timiraos, chief economics correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, now known as one of the great whisperers around the Federal Reserve. Nick, tell us about this report. Tell us about how close you think Donald Trump is to all of this, or whether we're just talking about some, crazy people off to the side. What are we supposed to think here?
Well, Andrew, it's a good question. I think the challenge with this is that there isn't the normal campaign policy apparatus with the Trump campaign, and that was what we saw in the first term in the White House. I think whatever the different advisors or people around the president put in front of him has a chance of becoming policy, at least for that day or for that period of time. And so I think you have to take seriously what different people around the president are proposing or would like to propose to him, because if it's something that he wants to do, he can turn to them and say, yeah, let's do this. And so I think what you have right now, I mean, in some respects, the story is surprising because this idea that you would have, an arrangement with the Fed that is not the norm that we've had in the last 40 years. But on the other hand, it's not that surprising because look at what the first Trump term was like. This is what the president wanted to have. He wanted to have a Fed chair who he could call and he could say rates need to go down right now, or you need to stop raising interest rates. And so I think the challenge here is just who is going to be the Fed chair if Donald Trump has a second term? Who is going to be, the NEC director, the Treasury Secretary, because the personnel will be policy. The people who have these jobs will get to determine whether the institutional norms that have existed with the Fed continue.
I was surprised that when you saw a comment from the administration, rather than deny this was happening or say that they know nothing about it and that they would condemn it and it wasn't something that they were interested in, they didn't take that opportunity. Did that surprise you?
Not really. I don't read much into that. I think, like I said, there's just not a conventional policy process with the campaign, or really there wasn't much of a conventional policy process at the end of the first term. I think there are two, important differences from the first term if Donald Trump is reelected. One is that, when he took the presidency in 2017, the Fed had a number of vacancies. So he had an early opportunity to remake the Fed board. Now, he picked more of establishment figures like Randy Quarles and Jay Powell. This time, if you look at who he was nominating at the end of his first term, you had different, more idiosyncratic choices like Judy Shelton, Herman Cain. But this time around, Andrew, he won't have vacancies on the Fed board unless people leave. There are 7 governors. All the seats are filled. If nobody steps down, then it's a year before he gets one vacancy.
You did put one thing in it. You just said you talked to someone, and you're right. I don't know who's in charge, and he's got some other things going on. That it's probably not as cohesive a campaign when you're due somewhere else every single day. But even in your report, you say, what is it? Let's be very clear. If it doesn't come directly from the strategy session, don't take it seriously. I mean, they said that, didn't they?
They did. Yeah, they absolutely did say that. But, Donald Trump is talking to people right now about the Fed. He's interested in different views. He's thinking about this. He cares about the Fed a lot. He thinks a lot about interest rates. He knows what, 25 basis point increase in interest rates will do.
Right.
The second point I was going to make is
Republicans wouldn't go along with it. I mean, you also quote people in the article. There's 2 or 3 guys that said there's no way this would ever happen. And you got to get confirmation of anybody.
But he's saying he'll do it secretly, too. And part of the story, Nick, which was that he said that there was going to be an implicit secret arrangement made effectively between a candidate who would have to effectively pledge their allegiance to the president,
but then and then be confirmed.
Get confirmed, and with a private secret deal that they're going to be talking to each other to basically get approval before they make these decisions. I mean, I don't know, Nick. I read the story and I thought, if true, this is outrageous. So why don't we start calling a spade a spade?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, you're right. The person that the president ultimately picks to run the Fed, that is how the president gets to influence monetary policy. I mean, that is the institutional arrangement we have. And then the question about whether Senate Republicans would go along with this. When we started hearing about this some time ago, I started talking to Senate Republicans to see what they thought. And you can see, I mean, we put them in the article. The Senate Republicans I spoke to did not like this idea very much. But the question is, at the end of the day, if Donald Trump is the president and he has a several-seat majority in the Senate, will he be able to get whoever he wants onto the Fed board and into the chair? That certainly seems possible. So I think it's something you have to take seriously.
I don't see how the Supreme Court is any less sacrosanct than the Fed. And you have... people on your side.
What you're saying is the next Fed chair is a Manchurian candidate. That's actually what we're saying here.
You want 15 people on the Supreme Court to have 9 liberal judges.
I didn't say that at all.
Okay, some people do. Some people want to do that.
No, I think
so
there's